Nigeria only exists in reality on paper. There are no Nigerians.
So, what's next?
Nationalism is easy when you have a homogeneous culture.
The parts of Nigeria are greater than its sum.
We tend to measure Nigeria by definition of the last 200 to 300 years.
The collective Nigerian past began on January 1st, 1914. First things first, Nigeria was set up as a business for the British Crown.
We've accepted a colonial notion that there are three dominant ethnic groups in Nigeria. That is the Hausa to the north, the Igbos to the east, and the Yoruba to the west. The idea of dominant ethnic groups also imply less dominant minority groups. And this is more of a setup that was more conducive from an administrative perspective for the colonial British.
The Royal Niger Company created a lot of business enterprises along the Niger and the Shada rivers. The Shada River was renamed into the Benue at some point. The British Crown bought this enterprise from the Royal Niger Company at the beginning of the 20th century and eventually merged the two pieces into one, but crucially administered them separately. So because we were administered separately, we were never a nation in the true sense of the word. That mistrust, that seeing each other as different, has persisted.
A fragile union of different tribes. We're familiar strangers, so we know, up north you have the Hausa, you have the Fulani, south, you have people in the south, you have people in the southeast. You know, there's a saying that Yoruba people that once you're no longer in the southwest and you're south something, they just call you Igbo. Whether you could be middle belt, you could be south or Moiboni. So, and that's the whole idea with Nigeria. Everybody doesn't really know, you don't know your neighbor, you don't know the next tribe. And that was caused by, I would say, you know, the first union of Nigeria, the amalgamation, where Lord Lugard decided to put, according to historians, a very, very rich young bride with an old man who was making that kind of money. So that was basically for joining the north to the south for economic reasons, where the north would be benefiting from the south. And that created a mistrust. And shortly after independence, we saw how that mistrust grew into what now you know as the Civil War.
If civil war comes, and I do think it is imminent, you're quite right, it will for us be the cause of freedom.
Where we went wrong was slavery, when slavery became industrialized. So essentially we've been in a 500-year spiral. So I think it's important to note that there were two forms of slavery. There was the trans-Saharan slavery, which is people from Arabia coming to take slaves from here. And then there was the transatlantic slavery, people from Europe coming to take slaves from here to the Americas. What those two events, which went on for, in the case of the trans-Saharan slavery, went on for close to 1,000 years, while the transatlantic slavery went on for close to 500 years. What those two events did was that they destroyed the fabric of trust. So the long-term effect of that is that till today, Nigeria is a low-trust society. We do not trust ourselves. In many cases, it's unconsciously indoctrinated in us from when we are very little. That is the original trauma that we have, and every other thing that has gone wrong is built on top of that lack of trust.
I think the single most consistent thing between, let's say 1900 and now, beyond jollof rice, is like the people that live in what is currently Nigeria have been subdued a lot.
The lack of trust has fed into another very bad habit we have, which is collective guilt. So I do something, they cannot get to me, so they look for the next person from my village. That is trauma. So think about it this way. 1953, Peter Nahuru moved the motion for independence. The North felt it wasn't ready for independence, disagreed with him. The South reacted badly. Some Northern leaders came to Lagos for a meeting, for parliamentary sitting. They were booed by people in Lagos, and they went back to Kano and said, those Southerners will get them. And then the action group went to Kano for a campaign, got attacked, and before you know it, the attack spread with a particular ethnic group targeted for something they knew nothing about. But again, that's collective guilt built on by mistrust. Follow 13 years later, 1966, some young men in the army, including in a misguided manner, went and conducted a coup. Very unfortunately, the pattern of killings of leaders was sectional. Whatever the reasons they had for not killing, for example, M.I. Opara or Dennis Osadebe, are moot. What the effect was that they killed people from the north and from the west, none from the east. Nobody bothered to ask whether they were acting on instructions from their villages. Instead, the entire ethnic group was blamed. And 6 months later, somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 people were killed in retaliation. That's vintage Nigeria, collective guilt. 5 young men, one of them a Yoruba guy for the records, committed a crime. They were not punished, their people were punished. And we have that mentality of collective guilt, which we have carried on up until now. So as we speak, in the forests around different parts of Nigeria, there are herders who are taking the laws into their hands. And what do we see? Everybody's blaming all Fulani people for what some herders are doing. It only helps to feed the mistrust. And when mistrust is fed, it creates a bad perception. Key lesson, perception is greater than reality. So people will react to you not because of what you really are, but because of how they see you are. So in Nigeria, we have created a bad perception of one another, and we keep reacting to one another based on those perceptions, rather than doing the hard work of trying to find out who we really are, or who. There's so much hard work, but I think the bottom line is the Nigerian culture is lazy. That's it. So because we are lazy, we don't do the hard work. We don't bother to think. We don't bother to think through our problems. We don't bother to find proper solutions.
Even though we might not have acts of violence like we saw in Biafra, we still have huge stereotypes about the other tribes in Nigeria. We see that even play in Nollywood. There was a time in Nollywood, your average Igbo billionaire was a ritualist. It's crazy. Or you look at people from the north as illiterate, backward. Or you look at people from southwest as loud and cunning. Yeah, so I see tribalism as being one major issue in Nigeria, and it has really, really affected us. Civil war is probably the most unfortunate incident that happened in Nigeria, because that was from us. That was not even from the white man himself. The disunity that have been brewing for centuries finally came to fruition, and for 3 years, a tribe was slaughtered because they decided that, this thing called Nigeria doesn't favor us anymore, and we have to, go our own way. And the powers that be said no, and there was a horrible 3 year civil war. And even when the Biafran forces surrendered, and there's this talk of no victor, no vanquish, we're going to rehabilitate everybody, it was just mere word of mouth. It wasn't anything. Igbos that didn't even experience the civil war still feel like second-class Nigerians today, because the tribalism is so omnipresent. It's everywhere. Even though it's not loud, it's everywhere. You can feel it. And that also has spread tribalism further into the minds of our homes of everyday of Nigerians. Like, if you have dinner with a Nigerian family of a particular tribe, you'll be surprised at what they say about the next tribe. There is no, oh, this is the best tribe, or this is good, oh, this tribe doesn't. Every tribe in Nigeria is tribalistic, or at war, they have stereotypes about the next tribe. It is just the way we are, because we do not see ourselves as Nigerians, because Nigeria was forced upon us. So at the end of the day, as a man, you see yourself as a man, then a Yoruba man, then you not say you're a Nigerian.
The military is one of the worst things that happened to like what is the Nigerian state, because what it did was we didn't learn how to build capacity, right? You develop when there's stability, but the entire concept of military rule is instability. It's like there is chaos. Someone tries to come and restore order by force.
Military rule puts Nigeria back for decades, and it was still going well in the 60s and 70s, but when we now entered the 80s, and we had our present president, followed by IBB, followed by Abacha, those three military rulers killed Nigeria totally, and that is where we are at today. They totally crumbled the little things that we were able to achieve in the 60s and 70s. They crumbled it in the 80s and 90s, and we are seeing Obasanjo tried a little bit, but those years really took a lot from Nigeria, and we are still trying to get out of that rubble.
If you happen to be Yoruba, you weren't aware that there was a difference between being a Yoruba from, say, Nigeria versus being from Benin. You were part of a kingdom or an empire that probably spread from this point to this point. But culturally, you had your rituals, you had the things that you had to do, you had your expectation, and that was pretty clear. Now, post-colonial, you still had that cultural identity, you still had that ethnic identity. But now the question of what exactly is your national identity was never really answered. With the colonial rule, it was slightly easier, and I say this in quotation, easier because as a colony, we existed for a purpose, and that purpose was to serve the crown, the interests of the British. And so we all had that in common. We knew that, yes, I am Yoruba, but then I exist in Nigeria to serve the interests of the Queen, even though I don't know who she is or what it is. But I knew who her representatives were. I knew that when I liked things, it was because of the Queen. If I didn't like it, it was because of the Queen, and all of that. So in a sense, being a colony gave us a shared identity. We were all part of this colony, and we had this in common.
An identity is beginning to emerge called a Nigerian.
There's a lot of despair for the average Nigerian. There's very little incentive to identify as a Nigerian, because there's one thing that's guaranteed to let you down, and that thing is Nigeria, right? Like, it is your birthright to be let down by Nigeria.
And the way Nigeria was set up after the amalgamation, it was set up to provide profits to a very narrow elite who were all at the time whites, used to escape during the summer months to London, come back. There was never a presence of, and this is me being charitable, more than 5,000 colonial officers in the country at the time. I think the more accurate number is about 1,000, but let's just be charitable. It hasn't changed. That arrangement has not changed. Nigeria today serves no more than 50,000 people. And these people jet in and jet out. Many of them don't live here. So essentially, Nigeria is a farm. It's their farm where they come in the morning, take, and then leave to go and enjoy in more civilized places.
In Nigeria, the history is hidden for a reason.
Just like any other country, protests are not new in Nigeria. They've always, I will dare argue that they're not something that would go away.
So Nigeria has had epochs of protests. The first major protest was the Aba women's protest of 1929, which the British delegitimized by calling it Aba women's riots. 7 years later, there was the Aba women's protests Again, the British called those riots. Then in 1945, there was a general strike. And then we didn't have any unified protest against bad governance until 43 years later, in 1988, the anti-SAP protests. And then after the anti-SAP protests, again, that's use of language. And language is very important. The government of the day called it anti-SAP riots. You see, when you call something protests, people ask, what are they protesting about? When you call something riots, people become defensive and want the rioters put down. So governments tend to delegitimize by using the expression riots as opposed to protests. After that, the next big set of protests that we had were the petrol subsidy protests before EndSARS.
The act of a people even saying that, you know what, we're not more doing Nigeria with you people, we're going to start our own country. It is protest, right? And that as far as I'm concerned, is the biggest protest in Nigerian history.
With the EndSARS protest, it seemed like, again, for once, there was a certain unity of purpose. The entire country could agree that what the demands of the protesters represented the collective best interest of every Nigerian. Better governance, human rights respected by the police. The police needed to be, to police essentially responsible. And at the point, the quote was just simple and straightforward: stop killing us. And everyone could agree that, yes, this is a good mantra. We really need the police to stop killing those that they're supposed to be policing. And we need responsible governance and all of these things. And so it was one of those moments where the entire country could rally around the message of the protest. It made sense. Even if you weren't out in the streets, you had support for, yes, this thing that they're standing for makes sense.
So it wasn't exactly shocking, right? So I think that the reason why we are not aware, or the reason why it shocked, a lot of why it shocked us, was because that history is not well documented.
Even the EndSARS protests initially started out national before some people began to put sectional issues into it, and then they cooled off rather quickly in the north. But at the beginning, they were national because you had a problem that every young person in the country feels, regardless, which is police brutality. And police brutality has gotten worse because, like pretty much every problem in the country, it's economic in nature. The police brutality is economic in nature because the government is bankrupt. They've not paid the police for quite a while. Police people are not paid properly. So essentially, you give a man a Kalashnikov, and then each month you give him 32,000 naira as salary. Sometimes the 32,000 naira does not come. What are you asking him to do? Because of the fact that the 32,000 naira does not come more often than not now, they have gotten more brazen. So essentially, the young people of Nigeria have been pushed to the wall. That is the bottom line of the whole EndSARS thing. Then you now add the fact that there was COVID, so which means that we had a critical mass of young people who were sitting at home doing nothing, include inflation. So a critical mass of young people were sitting at home doing nothing, and life is getting more expensive for them. That was a combustible mix.
So what was achieved and how do we move forward from that space? What typically is achieved when protests like this have such huge popular support, but then there isn't any seeming forward motion. What I mean by that is when so many people come together and expend so much energy and there seems to be nothing to come out of it, it leads back to this state of apathy where people start to believe that, what's the point? We gave it our best shot, what we thought was possibly the best shot we could ever give it, and nothing came of it. So what's the point of even trying? That is the negative end of what could possibly have come out of the EndSARS protest. What we would like to see, or what I would like to see, or what I hope for, what I pray for would come from that is a couple of key lessons. We've always known that young people are an essential part of driving and calling for change in any country. Nigeria is not an exception. And what we saw during the EndSARS protest was young people from across the diversity that makes up Nigeria came together in a unified purpose and worked actively to achieve that. That's what I think we need to do, and to be able to sustain, perhaps longer than a generation. We know that listening to stories of someone like Stacey Abrams in Georgia, who lost the election, her bid to be governor, but ended up turning the state from a major Democratic state to a Republican state in the United States. That's an inspiring story. But then when we look a bit deeper, we find that for that success that we heard about, there was about 10 years of sustained grassroots work that was done.
It's going to happen again. When it will happen again, I can't say, I'm not a prophet, but given that currently food inflation, which is the most critical aspect of inflation in a country like Nigeria, is at 19.6%. 19.6% food inflation essentially means that the price of food doubles, as in completely doubles, every 3 years. When you have that, it's just a matter of time. Food inflation is at 19.6%. Unemployment is at ridiculous levels. I can't even quote the figures, because the number of unemployed people walking around is more than the population of pretty much every other country in West Africa. And then you have that situation where, okay, so it's 11 out of every 20 people that are walking around without something to do. What do you expect them to do? At some point, it will explode. It's just natural. So, the EndSARS protest was a combination of different bad decisions that we've made as a country. We're still making some of those bad decisions, which means that's what we're going to have another protests at some point in time.
I want to ask all protesters to give 3 gbosas for themselves.
We've gotten it wrong with pretty much every protest that have ever happened in this country, because of the nature of the way our government looks at the people. So Nigeria's governments are not configured to protect the people. They are configured for regime security. So the moment a protest starts, the first thing the Nigerian state asks is, who is sponsoring them?
When there was this EndSARS, you remember the young people who wanted to march here and remove me when they were checked that EndSARS.
That's the first thing, because the Nigerian state's character is to think that these people who are protesting want to remove me from power. And that's where we got it wrong.
The most important thing is figuring out ways to continue to build and sustain momentum. It's natural, it will drop, it will rise. But I think the single most important thing to keep in mind is that I see a lot of people talking about the long game, right? A lot of people that you are playing against are more experienced, more sophisticated methods, greater distribution and reach.
We are seeking for change, but we are seeking for change where? On Twitter. Bro, Facebook is still the largest social media app in Nigeria. I don't think it covers 50% of Nigerians. There's a reason why the political elite use bus conductors, downfall drivers, market women. That's the grassroots. All this fancy English we are speaking will go nowhere. Because come election time, these people will sit back and the structure they put in place will just work for them automatically. So instead of you hurling abuse at people, that's not the way. The EndSARS, protest gave us a momentum, but the momentum has died. Momentum has died now. Where is the political party? Where are our own power structures in the grassroots to negate the NURTW or the Women Market Association? Where? Well, you can't just go to the streets on election day and say everybody votes for, bruh.
We have spent decades delegitimizing politics. I mean, growing up, my mom always used to tell us that politics is for bad people, it's for dirty people. We've spent decades doing that. We are not just going to turn it around. Now, what is even worse is that because so it has become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because our outcomes have been consistently bad, you now have a situation where it is the worst of the worst who enter politics, people who in many cases are not even capable of thinking. So we consistently have bad outcomes, which reinforces the belief that only the worst enter politics. That means that it is unlikely for us to get a critical mass of people in political office to change stuff. And you can also see it as an example, the way people are beginning to boycott elections. So, give us an example. What was the turnout in the last presidential election? Do you remember? It was quite poor. It was in the 30s. So, this was 35% or so of registered voters that voted for President Buhari for a second term. Registered voters. Of that 35%, it was almost an even split between him and Atiku. So give or take, I think Buhari had was it up to 60% of the votes? I don't remember the exact figures, but it wasn't a landslide by any definition of the word. It was give or take about 60%. Let's grant it at 60%. So 35% of the 88 million or so who were registered to vote, because it's not all Nigerians that were registered to vote. 35% of the 88 million registered to vote, and then of that 35%, 60%. So give or take, it's about 5 million people of a purported population of 206 million that picked the president. The rest did not have a say in picking the president. And you can see this pattern being repeated in all the elections. Governorship elections, turnout is averaging somewhere between 25 and 35%, all of them. What that means is that the Nigerian government at all levels is suffering from a crisis of legitimacy. The recent senatorial elections in Lagos East, only 11,000 people came out to vote. 11,000. This is in a city that claims to have 20 million people. 11,000 people picked a senator to represent them. That is a crisis of legitimacy. So politically, we have a crisis of legitimacy because people are no longer participating. So how does government make decisions that people will feel part of? It all boils down to the fact that there is no social contract.
The average young Nigerian has mentally seceded away from Nigeria. You provide your own light, you provide your own water, you provide your own security. So why do I care about voting at the end of the day? I am my own president. So if Buhari is talking on TV, I don't care because it won't affect my life anyway.
I also think that if we stop thinking of Nigeria in the context of the next election, we're better off.
Frankly, I don't know what to do next, what we should do next. And let me tell you why. There's no sense of identity. There's no sense of ownership of Nigeria.
So, what is next?